Let's jump into the theory segment. A couple of weeks ago, I asked you to start pitching me some ideas for theory segments. One of the things that you mentioned that I really liked was assessing your strengths and weaknesses, and then very serendipitously, we got a question from a Discord user that I really liked that kind of tied into this question. And he said he's been playing a ton of cash successfully. He can't seem to figure out GPPs, mostly playing low stakes single and 3-max, which we love. Cash lineups for the first 3 weeks have been his best lineups of the week. GPP lineups, mix of cash plays, high value stacks, players in good positions that are contrarian. Is it a string of bad luck or is it a faulty GPP process? We're gonna kind of tear down this question a little bit and talk about how to assess your strengths and weaknesses. Before we get into that, I mean, I think what people need to understand and new DFS players need to understand, and I'll throw it back to you, but if you're playing GPPs, the nature of a GPP is high variance. And I think if you're new to DFS, the hard pill to swallow is what high variance actually means, right? That means we're going to have a lot of very low or no payout weeks and then some huge spike weeks. And by nature, if we're playing players that aren't good values, that are high variance, that have high ceilings and low floors, those lineups are going to have really low floors. So there's going to be a lot of stretches where our cash lineup is our best lineup. And psychologically, it's really hard to look at that and say, there's no way I'm doing this right. These lineups suck. These lineups are going to suck a lot. And that's kind of the point, is that if they were obvious and good, everybody would be playing them. But when the unexpected happens, that's when our expected value comes into play. So I obviously haven't dug into this user's process. We're going to dig into some general processes here, but I think that is kind of how your experience should be going. If you're having a ton of min caches and you're just barely squeaking by, but you're never having these big spikes, you're probably actually doing something wrong, right? Like if all of your lineups are just always min caching, you're probably not building lineups that have the upside. Like by nature, that variance is going to come into play. So like, even without looking at what this user's doing, without looking at his lineups, it sounds like he's a very involved subscriber. My guess is his process is probably fine. Most likely, if his cash lineups are doing well, he probably knows what he's doing. Cash is really hard. So if you're playing well in cash, it's two different games, and we're going to get into assessing those different things, but that's a normal experience. What would you say?
Well, first of all, I think this is a very normal place to be, because once you find a place like 4 for 4 and you have really strong projections and you have access to strong podcasts with good information and articles that sometimes say conflicting information, what you get is really, really good at understanding what the very best plays are. Yeah. But then, to answer your question, this question specifically, when you move to GPPs and you start thinking of range of outcomes and way games could go differently, and the psychology of actually playing a game against the rest of the people using the same information and sometimes even the same websites, articles, and projections as you. And so one of the things I actually have at the very bottom of my notes, but I think it's really relevant right here, is no one can do this work for you.
Yeah.
This is work that you need to do on your own. We can give you value plays. We can give you models and data science articles, all that stuff. We can give you award-winning projections. But what you do with them, and I mean that collective you, is the way that you win or lose this game. And so I think it was really intelligent, TJ, to start off with building variance into your expectations. One thing I noticed in this question is it says you're playing low stakes single and 3 entry tournaments. That means you're probably playing in those tournaments with 2,000, 5,000, 10,000 people in them. Do we expect to take those down extremely often? Absolutely not. We play a large majority of our bankroll in cash games so we can weather the storms, so that we can have more and more and more opportunities to play games like that. So when it is our day, we can get there. And that's the biggest thing for me, is so many people playing DFS right now are not playing DFS as a means to make it's not their primary income for the year, but this game does attract a lot of people who have a very strong source of primary income, which means that they're okay taking a loss, taking a wash in exchange for taking big, intelligent risks so that when it is their day, they get the biggest amount of payoff. So I know it's a little bit of a cop-out to say you have to stay the course when you're playing this kind of style, but you need to get your bankroll and your cash games to the point where you can stay the course for an infinite amount of time so that we get you to your day. I think really that's the biggest part of the psychology, and really that's what variance means, is that there's a lot of no before there's one yes.
Yeah, I would I'll use my own results as an example, and I've shifted my approach a lot in the past couple of years, where maybe 4 years ago, even 3 years ago, probably, very, very cash game heavy, with just a slant towards smaller buy-in GPPs, not like micro stakes, but smallish mid stakes, I would say, but still bigger fields, and lots of min caches like I just talked about. And my results are pretty steady, but not a lot of upside. And if you look at my results over the last couple of years, you'll see a lot of very down weeks, or weeks that are zeros, negatives. But then the weeks that are good are really, really good. And I think it's easy for someone that hasn't played a ton to look at that and say, well, if that week doesn't happen, you're screwed. Your whole season's over. But that's kind of the point. And this isn't even to say that I'm good or bad, whatever you think of those results. The point is, like, that's kind of the point, is like, we only need a couple weeks to make our whole year, right? But if we're going to have that that kind of approach to the game, and if you are playing, like, if this person is playing like I play and they're playing one cash lineup and a 3 max tournament and that's it, like, it's really easy to whiff for a month straight. Like, if you're playing 100 lineups a week, like, a lot of them are going to miss. So if you're only playing 4, like, you can go a month without cashing anything, especially in tournaments. So yeah, that's not surprising at all. And if you're in a similar situation, I don't think you could get discouraged. But let's start getting into some of the processes of how you can at least set yourself up for assessing your strengths and weaknesses and understanding your game a little bit. And I'm going to start with, basically, this is something I've written about a ton, and you actually can find an article on it called just setting goals if you go into the DFS strategy hub. But basically, it's like, what are your goals in this game? And you talked about if you're going to be try to do this for a living, or if you're going to try to grind it out, or if you have a lot of expendable income and you don't mind firing it, whatever, max entering the milli or whatever you're trying to do. But is your goal to become a full-time player? Is your goal to have some Christmas money come at the end of the season, have a couple extra grand to play with? Or is your goal to win the milli or to get a live qualifier and you don't really care about your ROI? All of those players are going to have really different approaches, right? And if your game selection isn't lining up with those goals, then you're going to have a disconnect in your game. And I think it comes down to your risk aversion. And that's just what's your expendable income, or what is your relationship with that expendable income? If you're somebody that is, even if you have 500 grand, if you're going to be uncomfortable losing a couple grand every week, you shouldn't be playing a lot of tournaments. Like, if you don't like seeing that 4-digit go negative in 1 week, you probably shouldn't be playing a lot of tournaments. You should probably be playing just some, playing some 50-50, playing some cash games, playing some triple ups, 5x games, some 100 mans, and that's okay. Like, if that's what you want to do. But if you have that relationship with real money, you're not going to be able to withstand the ebbs and flows of a game where you're pushing really thin margins. And I use the poker analogy a ton on here, and it's why you can oftentimes walk into a poker game and you hear people say, oh, well, that guy just has the most money, he's running over the table. Well, guess what? He has the same amount of money as you on the table. He just doesn't care if he fires off $300 on every street and you're worried about losing that in your whole game. So yeah, he's going to run it over. And it's kind of the same mindset. Like, if you need to really be comfortable firing off whatever you're firing off. So if your risk aversion isn't matching up with whatever your goals are, there's always going to be a disconnect there.
Yeah, well said. And I think too, once you set a goal, if you're not tracking it, you're not actually trying to achieve the goal.
Mm-hmm.
And that kind of leads into my next sort of question that I urge you guys to ask yourselves is, are you tracking your progress as effectively as you really could? Because one thing that I'll note is that Roto Tracker and sites like that are really good if you're an MME player, a multi-sport player, and you have a large sample size, so you need to pull everything into a pool and just see where that line graph goes. And eventually, in your football DFS life, you'll get there too. But ultimately, I think especially when we're talking about this specific question on Discord, if you're a single entry or a 3 entry or even like 5 or a 20 entry max, you should be tracking your progress at the lineup, the player, or maybe even the stack level. You should be having some sort of spreadsheet or notes app that helps you in the pre-slate process identify the way you were thinking about the slate, so that when the slate occurs, you can go back and start to evaluate your progress. And one thing that I think people sometimes forget is they start to articulate their goals. And as I said before, they stop there. They stop before they put in the time to actually improve on that weakness that they've possibly identified or that change. So I really feel like don't just start at identifying these things that you're strong or you're weak at, or the parts in your play that you feel aren't as good as your other parts. Maybe certain positions aren't as good. But I do think that if you can have a systemized process for getting to Sunday, and then another systemized process for evaluating Sunday, you get better a lot faster.
Yeah, and I'll say I actually don't use something like Roto Tracker for that reason. Roto Tracker, for those that don't know, it's an app or a website where you can just upload your results and everything's automated for you. And the automation process is actually what I don't like about it, because I have my own spreadsheet and I do look at my games like on a very granular level. So when when I'm putting them into the spreadsheet by hand, it's not by hand. I'm still like moving them from one spreadsheet to another, but it forces me to look at every single one, because every time I do the addition and calculate my ROI, it's making me look at exactly what happened that week. I can't just like be like, I lost 5% this week, on to the next one. Like I'm looking at every single game. And on that note, when you talked about like looking at what you're doing on the player level or the stack level or whatever, I think one of the most important ways to assess your strength or weaknesses, you talked about this guy playing single entry. If you're playing a 50-50, if you're playing a head-to-head, if you're playing a 3X, every single game that you're playing is going to have a different strategy in terms of salary allocation, ownership allocation, stacking strategy, game flow strategy. All of these things are different by the size of the tournament, the payout of the tournament, the upside of the tournament. So the easiest thing you could do is you can go into your the games that you're playing, whatever your favorite game is, and look at the lineups that are winning. And if they're way different than what you're doing, going back to the question, what is my process like? Well, look at the players, not just the first place lineup. Look at the players that are consistently on top. Look at some of it's really easy. I think we've talked about this so many times. It's really easy to get the screen names of the best players in the world, go on to Roto Grinders, look at that leaderboard, see if they're in your tournament. Are they playing your tournament every week? And if you have a similar process to them, they don't have to be the same players. If they're on Odell and Baker when you're on Kirk Cousins and Jefferson, if it's in the same game, I wouldn't worry about getting that part right. Like you're kind of on the same track. Like you're stacking that game, you're stacking those quarterback wide receiver combos. Those are the things we're looking for. Are they paying up for running back? Are they taking chalk running backs in that tournament? Is our ownership percentages way different in your tournament than they are in the millie? Comparing your lineup to, it's the easiest thing to do, especially on DraftKings, where you can just hit click export to CSV and you get every single lineup in. Like you don't have to click 2 buttons, you don't have to click on other teams. And then taking those, we had this guy ask the question in Discord. Ask other good players, go in Discord, post your lineups, see what players at your same skill level are doing, and you're going to be able to bounce a lot of ideas off each other.
Yeah, I really like that. Especially getting out of your own head is so important. That's really a perfect transition to my last point here. Is I view this game in general as a 3-category process. And identifying your strengths and weakness needs to happen within these 3 categories that I call analysis, insight, and mindset. Analysis, as you would expect. How do you go about learning this game? Some people are really good at DFS and they don't even know football at all. They know math, they know data, they know how to parse historical information, and that's okay. Maybe you watch the games and your gut is honed better than your brain right now. That is valid analysis. So when we talk about strengths and weaknesses, you need to get to the point in your analysis process so that you can move on to these second two categories, which is insight and mindset. Insight, we start by helping you with things like breakout receiver models where people are performing under or over expectation, but also insight means what the rest of the field is doing, ownership projections, understanding range of outcomes, understanding game environments. And those things can be, that's the second level stuff that you might not be really prepared for. If, you're ready from the football analysis standpoint, but then incorporating the behaviors of other people can be really hard. And finally, I think this is really important and overlooked in general in DFS is your own personal mindset. You are playing a game with your mind against other people's minds. They are making the best decisions they possibly can, and so are you. The stakes in that regard, in terms of how hard we're all working to make the best choices, are extremely high. And your mindset, your psychology, whatever you want to call it, needs to be at a really, really strong level because you're playing against pros, people who are literally professionals at that part. And so I think we do overlook it, especially when it's your first few years in DFS. Get your mind right for how you're making decisions on Sunday.
Yeah, the mindset part is super important, especially like within the week or within the day, the slates. It's really easy, like something I think people can catch themselves doing if you're at your computer all day, especially if you throw back a couple pops after kickoff, is start chasing those losses, right? And I don't remember the exact term. I think it was I think it was Skolansky in poker. I wish I could credit it properly, but like basically the point of no return, where like after you hit a certain threshold of losses, like it all feels the same, right? So if you fire off 500 on the main slate and you just get crushed, and then let me fire off another 100 early entry, and all of a sudden you're up to like 1,000 in losses, and you're like, screw it, I'm already down 1,000, let me throw another 1,000 at the showdown. Like that's a real problem, and that's probably like a bigger issue, and you should be like limiting yourself on DraftKings. But there's people that can afford it and still do that. And even if you only do it once, that could be the difference. We just talked about make or breaking your season with one really good week. I mean, one really bad week where you go outside of that proper mindset can make or break your year. And kind of like on that same note quickly, if your strengths and weaknesses is honed and you're really good at lineup selection and your game selection matches up with your goals, outside of evaluating and reviewing your lineups. And again, this is why I go back every week and like looking at it, putting in my results on my own, is evaluating your game selection. And that's not just picking the best games like possible, but like, can you do things like if you're at a $33 level, but you can afford to jump to a $50 level, but you're not sure, if you're getting a 3 or 4% drop in rake every week by moving up to that, maybe it's time to move up. If you're missing out on free money by not chasing overlay, by not putting your cash lineups in like small field GPPs, and your lineup went off for 200 DraftKings points, but you only had it in 50-50s, you just cost yourself a lot of money on the season. If you're not playing free rolls, all of these things, if you're playing within your bankroll, like you talked about, all of these things really have a cumulative effect on your bottom line and where you're strong and where you're weak. And I think that is one place where people are really, really weak is game selection, doing all of these things that I just talked about. It's all hidden money, and you might say, well, listen, I'm not winning, so how can these things matter? When you do win, they all start adding up a lot.
Yeah, man. And it's just, again, it's all about small decisions that are slightly better than your opponents. Finding free money is just small decisions that help you over the long run. And really my last thing I'll say here on this topic is in Fooled by Randomness, Nassim Nicholas Taleb talks about just human beings' ability in general to retroactively explain unexplainable events.
Yeah.
Remember that we are dealing with a significant amount of variance, a significant amount of randomness, and a weird oblong ball that bounces in very strange ways sometimes. Don't fool yourself into thinking that you could understand every single aspect about what's occurring. And when you go back and take your notes, be okay being honest with yourself, saying, I don't know how we could have figured out this player hit. I'm not sure how my process would have led me to this game environment being the shootout that everyone wanted. It's okay to not have the answer. It's worse to fool yourself into thinking you have the answer.
Yeah. I think that's a really good note to go out on. And I think that people should be going outside of DFS circles to kind of expand how they're thinking about just improving their processes in any game or anything where you're trying to improve. I think there's a lot more outside of the DFS world. But if you want to check out like really expanded discussions on what we just covered here in 15 minutes, there are a ton of articles that cover these things in the DFS Strategy Hub on 4for4. Go to the DFS drop down, just click on Strategy Hub, and you'll find close to 100 articles or podcasts on that.